Nobody expected that a $1,500 receipt would become the most talked about moment of the night. Ethan Carter could still hear those words in his mind as he stood outside the warmly lit restaurant, hands tucked into the pockets of his graduation suit, trying to steady his breathing before walking in. It was supposed to be a celebration, the kind of night people remember for laughter, photos, and proud smiles. But something about the air felt heavier than he expected. Inside, long tables had been arranged for family and close friends, decorated with simple white candles and graduation balloons in navy and gold. And as Ethan pushed the door open, he was immediately greeted by a wave of voices that sounded cheerful on the surface, but carried an edge he couldn't quite ignore. "There he is, the graduate," someone called out, followed by polite applause that felt slightly delayed, almost performative, as Ethan offered a small smile and made his way to his seat beside his mother's side of the table. His grandmother, Linda Carter, sat across from him with calm eyes and a quiet presence, saying nothing yet, just observing the room like she always did when she was trying to understand more than what was being said out loud. The conversation started light, as expected, with questions about his major in communications, plans after graduation, and whether he had figured things out yet. But beneath every casual question, there was something sharper, like people were measuring him without directly admitting it. Ethan answered politely, saying he was exploring options, maybe internships in media or digital production, but each response seemed to invite a slightly different reaction, a half smile here, a raised eyebrow there, subtle signals that made him feel smaller with every passing minute. Then came the topic that shifted the entire mood, introduced casually by an uncle who leaned back in his chair and asked about that $1,500 situation, as if it were a funny misunderstanding rather than something Ethan had quietly dealt with weeks ago. The table didn't explode immediately, but the energy changed in a way that was impossible to miss. Forks slowed down, conversations paused mid-sentence, and eyes began to drift toward Ethan as if waiting for a response he didn't want to give. Someone chuckled under their breath, then another person followed, and within seconds the moment turned into something heavier, a shared amusement that left Ethan sitting there feeling exposed in a way he hadn't prepared for on what was supposed to be his night. He forced a small laugh, the kind people use when they don't know what else to do, but it didn't land, and instead of easing the tension, it seemed to encourage it, like the room had decided this was a story worth repeating. "It's not a big deal," someone said lightly, but even that only made it worse, because now it felt like his discomfort was part of the entertainment. Ethan looked down at his plate, the food suddenly untouched, the conversations around him blending into a low hum that felt far away, as if he were sitting just outside of his own life. Across the table, Linda Carter remained silent, her expression unreadable, her gaze moving slowly between the faces of the people laughing and her grandson who had gone quiet, as if she was collecting details that no one else thought mattered yet. And in that moment, without anyone realizing it, the night had already begun to shift into something that would not end the way they expected. The laughter did not disappear quickly. It lingered in the room like a sound that everyone pretended had already ended, yet still echoed faintly under every new sentence that followed. Ethan Carter sat still, his hands resting near his plate, trying to focus on anything other than the way people kept glancing at him, as if he were part of a running joke that had not yet reached its conclusion. Across from him, Linda Carter finally shifted slightly in her chair, her fingers gently folding over one another on the table, her expression calm but no longer distant, as if she had made a quiet decision about when to speak. The conversation around the table attempted to move forward, someone bringing up work stories, another person commenting on the restaurant, but the energy never fully recovered, because the moment before had already changed how everyone saw Ethan in that space. Then the uncle who had first mentioned the amount leaned back again, clearly enjoying the attention he had created, and added another remark about how college lessons can be expensive, which caused a few people to laugh again, softer this time, but still pointed enough to keep Ethan silent. He felt the weight of it in his chest, not anger, but something heavier, the kind of discomfort that comes when you realize a room has already decided your story without asking for your version. Linda Carter watched all of it without interruption, her eyes steady, following each reaction around the table, and when her gaze finally returned to Ethan, there was something in it that suggested she had seen enough. She slowly reached for her glass of water, took a small sip, and set it down with deliberate care, the sound subtle but enough to draw attention without her needing to raise her voice. The room quieted almost instinctively, not because she demanded it, but because something about her presence made people pause when she moved. "I have been listening," she said calmly, her voice not loud but clear enough that every person at the table could hear it without effort, and the tone carried no anger, only certainty. A few guests shifted in their seats, unsure if this was the moment to continue laughing or to stop completely, and within seconds the atmosphere tightened again, but in a different way, less amused and more uncertain. Ethan looked up at her, not expecting her to intervene, and for the first time that evening, he did not feel completely alone in the silence. Linda Carter turned her head slightly toward the uncle who had spoken earlier, her expression still composed, and then she repeated the number softly, almost as if testing how it sounded out loud in that room, the amount that had been treated like a punchline just minutes before. $1,500, she said, and the way she said it made the phrase feel different, stripped of humor, stripped of judgment, and replaced with something closer to significance. The uncle gave a small shrug, trying to maintain the same light tone, but it did not land the same way anymore, because the room was no longer following his lead. Linda Carter did not raise her voice, did not show frustration, but she adjusted her posture slightly, placing both hands now on the table as if she was preparing to explain something that required attention rather than reaction. "Before anyone decides what that means," she continued, still steady, still measured, "I think it is important to understand where that number actually comes from." The room grew quieter, not because it was forced, but because curiosity began to replace amusement, and even those who had been laughing earlier now found themselves waiting without speaking. Ethan felt his heartbeat slow just slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because for the first time that night, the narrative in the room was no longer controlled by the people who had turned it into a joke. And in that silence, something important was beginning to surface, something that no one at the table had fully understood yet, but everyone was about to hear. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything Ethan Carter had experienced that entire evening, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it forced every person at the table to sit with their own assumptions without the comfort of laughter to soften them. Linda Carter remained still for a moment longer, her eyes steady as she looked around the table, as if she was giving everyone a chance to realize that the conversation had already changed direction. The uncle who had started it all now shifted uncomfortably in his chair, suddenly less confident, while a few others avoided eye contact, focusing instead on their plates or their drinks as if those objects could provide an escape from what was about to be said. Ethan did not speak either, his attention fixed on his grandmother, sensing that whatever came next would not be casual or easily dismissed. Linda Carter slowly exhaled, not in frustration, but in a way that suggested careful thought. Then she leaned forward slightly, her hands still resting neatly on the table, and began to speak with the same calm tone that now carried more weight than before. "That amount," she said, pausing just long enough for the room to settle further, "is not something that came from a mistake or a misunderstanding." A few heads lifted at that, curiosity replacing discomfort, because the certainty in her voice made it clear she was not correcting a joke, she was correcting a narrative. She turned slightly toward Ethan as she continued, her expression softening just a little, not in pity, but in recognition. "It came from a decision that was not easy for him to make," she said, and at that moment Ethan felt his chest tighten slightly, not from embarrassment anymore, but from the unfamiliar feeling of being spoken about with clarity rather than judgment. The room remained quiet, and even the earlier laughter had completely disappeared, replaced by a focused attention that felt almost unfamiliar in its intensity. Linda Carter looked back at the others and continued, her voice steady and deliberate. "People like to reduce things to numbers because it is easier that way, but numbers rarely tell the full story." She let that sentence sit in the air for a moment before adding more, carefully choosing her words so that nothing was rushed or unclear. That $1,500 was not spent on anything careless. It was part of something he took on when no one else was paying attention to what he was carrying. The uncle frowned slightly, as if trying to reconcile what he thought he knew with what was now being presented, while others at the table began to lean in just a little, signaling that the dynamic had fully shifted from amusement to attention. Ethan glanced down briefly, unsure how much of his own experience would be revealed, but he did not interrupt, because for the first time that night, the conversation was not being shaped by those who had misunderstood him. Linda Carter continued, her tone still calm, but now carrying a quiet firmness that made it impossible to ignore. He did not ask for recognition, she said, and he did not turn it into a story for attention. He simply handled it. A pause followed, longer this time, and in that pause the atmosphere of the room changed again, as people began to realize that what they had treated lightly was not something they fully understood. One of Ethan's cousins shifted in their seat and looked toward him with a different expression now, less teasing and more uncertain, as if reevaluating what they thought they knew. Linda Carter finally turned her full attention back to Ethan, her gaze softening further, and for a brief moment, the formality of the room seemed to fade. "You did what you had to do," she said quietly, "and that matters more than how it looked from the outside." The words landed differently than anything said earlier that evening. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but grounded in something steady and undeniable. Ethan felt his throat tighten slightly, not from humiliation, but from the realization that the story being told about him was no longer out of his control. Around the table, no one laughed anymore, and no one spoke immediately after, because the meaning of what had just been said was still settling in, reshaping everything they thought they had understood about the night. The shift in the room was no longer subtle. It had fully taken hold, changing the way every person at the table sat, looked, and listened, as if the atmosphere itself had been reset by the weight of what had just been said. Ethan Carter could feel it most clearly in the silence that followed his grandmother's words, a silence that did not feel empty anymore, but filled with reconsideration, as if everyone was quietly replaying the last few minutes in their minds and realizing they had misunderstood more than they wanted to admit. Linda Carter remained composed, her hands still resting on the table, her posture steady, but now she was no longer simply observing. She was guiding the direction of the moment with calm certainty. The uncle who had initiated the earlier laughter cleared his throat slightly, an attempt to regain some normalcy, but it came out weaker than intended, and no one followed his lead. Instead, attention stayed centered on the space between Linda Carter and Ethan, where something important had just been revealed without needing exaggeration or dramatics. Ethan himself did not speak, but his expression had changed, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because the way he was being perceived had begun to shift in real time. Linda Carter glanced briefly around the table again, then continued speaking, her voice measured and deliberate, as if she understood that every word now carried lasting weight. "It is easy to judge what you do not fully see," she said calmly, "and even easier to laugh at something when only part of the story is known." A few people nodded faintly, not in agreement exactly, but in recognition of the truth in her statement. She paused just long enough for that idea to settle before continuing, her tone still steady but slightly more personal. "What matters is not how something appears in a single moment, but what it represents over time." The room remained completely quiet, with no interruptions, no side comments, no attempts to redirect the conversation, because the energy that had once supported those reactions had completely disappeared. Ethan finally looked up more fully, meeting his grandmother's gaze, and in that exchange there was a quiet understanding that did not require explanation. Linda Carter gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging something only the two of them fully understood in that moment. Around the table, the earlier confidence that had fueled the teasing had dissolved, replaced by a more careful awareness, as guests began to realize they had participated in something without knowing its full context. One of Ethan's relatives shifted slightly forward, placing their hands together on the table, their expression now more thoughtful than amused, as if reconsidering their earlier reaction entirely. Linda Carter did not press further. She did not need to, because the change she intended was already happening without force. Instead, she softened her tone slightly and added one more thought, not to correct anyone, but to complete the picture she had begun to reveal. "Respect does not come from understanding everything immediately," she said, "but from being willing to pause when you realize you might not understand enough." That sentence seemed to land differently than anything before it, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple enough for everyone to recognize themselves in it. The uncle who had been the most vocal earlier lowered his gaze for a moment, no longer smiling, while others at the table sat in reflective silence, as if the structure of the entire evening had been quietly rearranged. Ethan felt something settle inside him, not triumph, not relief, but a quiet grounding that came from no longer feeling misrepresented in a room full of people who had just begun to see him differently. The conversation did not immediately restart, because no one seemed certain how to return to casual topics after what had just been acknowledged. Instead, the table remained in a suspended pause, where judgment had faded, curiosity had replaced assumption, and the story of the evening had already begun to move in a different direction without needing any announcement. The silence at the table did not feel as heavy anymore, but it also did not return to what it had been before. Instead, it settled into something more thoughtful, as if everyone present was carefully adjusting their understanding of the evening in real time. Ethan Carter could sense it in the way people avoided rushing into conversation, in the way even small movements like reaching for a glass or shifting in a chair were done with more awareness than before. Linda Carter remained composed, but her role in the moment had clearly changed. She was no longer correcting a misunderstanding. She was allowing the room to fully absorb what had already been revealed. Ethan sat quietly, his eyes moving between the faces around the table, noticing that the earlier expressions of amusement had been replaced with something closer to reflection and, in some cases, quiet uncertainty. The uncle who had previously been the most confident leaned slightly back in his chair, his arms no longer animated, his expression subdued, as if he was reconsidering not just what had been said, but how quickly he had judged it. No one seemed eager to restart casual conversation, because the shift that had taken place did not allow for an easy return to normal topics, and even the background sounds of the restaurant around them felt distant, almost irrelevant. Linda Carter finally broke the extended pause, not with a correction or explanation, but with a simple continuation of thought, her voice steady and calm, carrying the same quiet authority that had already changed the direction of the table. "Sometimes," she said, "what people see first is not the full truth. It is only the most visible part of it." She let the words settle before continuing, her gaze moving gently across the group, not challenging them, but inviting them to understand something deeper than surface-level interpretation. And when something is misunderstood early, it becomes very easy for people to build an entire story around that misunderstanding without realizing it. Ethan listened closely, feeling that her words were not only directed at the table, but also protecting something he had carried privately without ever needing to explain it out loud. Around the table, subtle changes continued to appear, small shifts in posture, softened expressions, lowered voices when brief comments were made, all signaling that the earlier narrative had been fully dismantled. One of Ethan's relatives finally spoke in a quieter tone, asking a cautious question about what exactly had been involved. But even that question carried a different intention now, not curiosity for entertainment, but a genuine attempt to understand. Linda Carter did not rush to answer. Instead, she nodded slightly, acknowledging the shift in tone, and then responded carefully, choosing her words in a way that avoided simplifying something that had already been misunderstood once. "It was not about the number itself," she said. "It was about responsibility, timing, and decisions made without attention or recognition." The room remained attentive, with no interruptions, as people began to mentally reconstruct what they thought they knew about Ethan's situation. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, not from discomfort, but from the strange feeling of hearing his own experiences described in a way that finally aligned with his reality rather than assumptions. The earlier energy of humor and casual judgment had not just faded, it had been replaced by a kind of quiet respect that no one had openly declared, but everyone was now beginning to feel. Linda Carter looked toward Ethan again, her expression softening further, and for a moment the formality of the table seemed to disappear entirely. "You carried it without turning it into something for attention," she said gently, "and that says more than any explanation ever could." The words did not create a reaction of shock or surprise, but instead settled into the group like a final piece of clarity, completing the shift that had been building since she first spoke. Ethan felt a steady calm take hold of him, not because the past was being rewritten, but because it was finally being understood in the correct context. Around him, no one laughed, no one interrupted, and no one tried to reduce the moment into humor again, because the structure of perception had already changed, and what remained was a room full of people quietly adjusting to a truth they had not seen at first. The conversation at the table had shifted into a quieter rhythm, one that no longer carried the sharp edges of misunderstanding, but instead moved carefully, as if everyone was aware that every word now had weight. Ethan Carter remained seated in the same position, but his posture had changed slightly, no longer tense, no longer withdrawn, but steady in a way that reflected the gradual easing of pressure he had been carrying since the beginning of the evening. Around him, the faces of his relatives no longer carried amusement or curiosity meant for entertainment, but something more restrained, a recognition that they had misread the situation earlier and were now trying to understand it properly. Linda Carter sat calmly, her hands folded again, her expression composed, but there was a softness in her eyes that suggested she was no longer addressing a misunderstanding. She was simply allowing space for clarity to exist. The uncle who had been most vocal earlier had not spoken again for several minutes, his earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stillness, and when he finally adjusted his chair slightly, it was done without the earlier sense of control or certainty. The room itself seemed different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the emotional temperature had shifted from reaction to reflection. A few guests exchanged brief, careful comments, but even those were spoken at a lower volume, as if they were aware that anything too casual would feel out of place in the current atmosphere. Linda Carter eventually spoke again, not to introduce new information, but to bring the conversation into a more complete understanding, her tone remaining steady and grounded. "What matters most," she said, "is not how quickly people form an opinion, but whether they are willing to correct it when they learn more." The sentence did not carry confrontation, but it created a moment of shared awareness around the table, because everyone understood, even silently, that they had formed opinions earlier in the night without knowing the full context. Ethan listened to her words, feeling something settle inside him that he had not expected to feel in a room full of family, not validation in the dramatic sense, but a quiet correction of how he had been perceived. One of his relatives nodded slowly, then spoke in a careful tone, asking a question about what had been required of him during that time. And the way the question was asked now reflected a completely different intention, no longer to interpret for humor, but to understand for clarity. Linda Carter responded without hesitation, but still with the same measured calm, explaining that responsibility often appears in forms that are not immediately visible to others, especially when people are not looking closely. As she spoke, the remaining tension in the room continued to dissolve, replaced by a more grounded awareness that what had been dismissed earlier was not something simple or insignificant. Ethan finally looked up fully, meeting the gaze of a few family members who were now watching him differently, not with judgment, but with a kind of reconsidered respect that had not been present before. The shift was not loud or dramatic, but it was unmistakable, like a quiet correction that had taken place across every person at the table without anyone needing to announce it. Linda Carter concluded her thought with a final, gentle remark, her voice steady and calm, emphasizing that understanding someone's actions requires patience and context, not immediate interpretation. The room did not respond with applause or statements, but with silence that felt different from before, no longer uncomfortable or tense, but thoughtful and settled. Ethan remained still for a moment, taking in the change, recognizing that the evening had moved far away from where it began, not through conflict or escalation, but through the gradual replacement of misunderstanding with awareness. Around him, the table had become something different, no longer a place of assumptions, but a space where what had been overlooked was finally being seen with clarity. The atmosphere at the table had fully settled into a state of quiet understanding, where no one felt the need to fill the silence with unnecessary words, because the meaning of the evening had already become clear without needing further explanation. Ethan Carter sat calmly now, his hands resting naturally, no longer carrying the tension he had felt earlier, as the shift in perception around him continued to solidify in subtle but undeniable ways. Around the table, His relatives maintained a more measured presence, their earlier assumptions replaced with a sense of caution and reflection, as if each person was now aware that their initial interpretation of the situation had been incomplete. Linda Carter remained composed, her posture steady, her expression gentle but firm, and it was clear that her role in the moment had transitioned from correcting misunderstanding to allowing understanding to fully take shape on its own. The uncle who had once been the most vocal earlier in the evening now sat quietly, occasionally glancing toward Ethan, but no longer with amusement or superiority, instead with a kind of restrained reconsideration that had not been there before. The conversation around the table did not return to its earlier tone, because everyone seemed to recognize that doing so would feel inappropriate after what had been revealed, and instead the discussion moved slowly, carefully, focusing on neutral topics that carried no weight of judgment. Linda Carter eventually spoke again, her voice calm and steady, not to revisit what had already been explained, but to gently close the emotional gap that had formed earlier in the evening. "It is not always easy," she said, "for people to see beyond what they first assume, especially when they do not have all the information." Her words were not directed at anyone in particular, but everyone at the table understood the meaning, and there was no resistance to it, only quiet acknowledgement. Ethan looked toward her as she spoke, feeling a sense of grounding that came not from validation in a dramatic sense, but from the simple fact that the truth of his situation had finally been recognized without distortion. One of his relatives leaned slightly forward, speaking in a more respectful tone than before, asking a thoughtful question about how long Ethan had been managing his responsibilities, and the question itself reflected a complete change in intent, no longer shaped by curiosity for entertainment, but by genuine understanding. Linda Carter answered briefly, explaining that time often reveals the depth of effort people do not immediately notice, and that what appears small at first glance can carry significant weight when seen in full context. As she spoke, the remaining traces of earlier tension dissolved further, replaced by a calm attentiveness that made the table feel unified in a way it had not been earlier in the evening. Ethan remained quiet, but his expression had softened, and there was a quiet steadiness in him now that reflected not a change in circumstance, but a change in how he was being perceived by those around him. No one interrupted, no one attempted to reframe the conversation with humor, because the shared understanding that had formed was now too stable to be easily dismissed. Linda Carter paused for a moment, looking across the table once more, and added one final thought, her tone still even and composed. When people take the time to understand instead of react, they often realize there was more happening than they initially saw. The sentence settled across the group without resistance, not as a correction, but as a conclusion that aligned the evening into perspective. Ethan took a slow breath, noticing how different the room felt compared to when the night began, not because the people had changed, but because their understanding of him had shifted in a way that could not be undone. The table remained quiet for a few seconds longer, not from discomfort, but from reflection, as each person adjusted internally to the realization that their first impressions had not told the full story, and that what they now understood carried far more meaning than what they had assumed before. The dinner table had long since lost the tension it once carried, replaced instead by a steady calm that felt almost unfamiliar compared to how the evening had begun. Ethan Carter remained seated, his posture relaxed now, his attention no longer divided by discomfort or uncertainty, but present in the moment as he observed how naturally the atmosphere had shifted over time. Around him, his relatives continued to speak in softer tones, the earlier energy of judgment completely absent, replaced by a careful awareness that everything said now would be measured differently than before. Linda Carter sat with quiet composure, her presence still anchoring the table, but no longer needing to guide or correct, because the conversation had already found its balance. The uncle who had once been at the center of the earlier misunderstanding had not spoken for several minutes, and when he finally did, his voice was noticeably more subdued, carrying none of the confidence that had defined his earlier remarks. He looked toward Ethan briefly, then lowered his gaze slightly as he spoke, offering a simple acknowledgement that what had been assumed earlier did not reflect the full picture. It was not dramatic, it was not forced, but it marked a clear change in how he positioned himself in the conversation. A few others followed with small comments of agreement, not to emphasize guilt or tension, but to recognize that their understanding had been incomplete. Linda Carter listened quietly, then offered a gentle nod, not to validate blame, but to acknowledge that awareness itself had shifted. What matters most, she said calmly, is not what is assumed in a moment, but what is understood once there is time to see clearly. Her words did not introduce anything new, but instead reinforced the steady resolution that had been forming since she first spoke earlier in the evening. Ethan looked toward her as she finished speaking, noticing how her tone remained unchanged, steady and grounded, as if she had never needed to raise her voice or assert authority in order for her message to be heard. Around the table, the final traces of earlier misunderstanding had fully dissolved, replaced by a shared recognition that the situation had been interpreted too quickly at the start. One of Ethan's relatives leaned back slightly, exhaling as if releasing tension that had been present without them fully realizing it, and then spoke in a more reflective tone about how easily assumptions can form when only partial information is available. No one interrupted, and no one tried to return to humor or casual teasing, because the emotional structure of the evening had already settled into something more thoughtful and stable. Ethan remained quiet, but there was a noticeable difference in him now, not in appearance, but in presence, as if the weight of being misunderstood had been lifted through understanding rather than confrontation. Linda Carter turned her attention to him once more, her expression softening slightly, and when she spoke again, it was not to explain or defend, but to acknowledge something that had been present all along. "You handled more than most people realized," she said gently, "and you did it without needing to make it visible to everyone." The words were simple, but they carried a sense of closure that did not require further elaboration. Ethan nodded slightly, not in response to pressure, but in quiet recognition, as the moment settled fully into place. The room did not move back into conversation immediately, because no one felt the need to rush away from what had just been understood. Instead, there was a shared stillness that felt complete rather than uncertain, as if the evening had naturally arrived at its final state without resistance. Around the table, people sat more comfortably now, no longer divided by misunderstanding, but connected by a clearer awareness of what had been missing earlier in the night. And in that calm, the story of the evening had fully transformed from one of misjudgment into one of understanding, without needing anything more than time and the willingness to see differently. The dinner had reached a point of stillness that no longer felt heavy, but instead felt complete, as if every person at the table understood that the emotional journey of the evening had already come to its natural conclusion. Ethan Carter sat quietly, no longer carrying the tension that had followed him earlier, his expression calm in a way that reflected acceptance rather than relief, as the final moments of the gathering settled around him. The conversations that remained were soft and unhurried, no longer shaped by misunderstanding or hesitation, but by a quiet sense of clarity that had developed over the course of the night. Linda Carter remained composed, her presence still steady and grounding, but there was no longer any need for her to guide the conversation, because the understanding she had helped bring forward was now shared across the entire table. The uncle who had once been the source of the earlier laughter had not spoken again in a significant way, but when he finally did offer a final comment, it was simple and subdued, acknowledging in his own way that what had been assumed at the beginning of the evening did not reflect the full reality. No one reacted strongly to it, because there was no longer anything to prove or correct, only a shared recognition that perspective had changed. Ethan glanced briefly around the table, noticing how the same people who had once laughed were now quiet in a different way, not from discomfort, but from reflection, as if they were still processing the distance between their first impression and what they understood now. Linda Carter finally turned her attention fully toward Ethan, her expression soft and steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried a sense of closure rather than explanation. "You do not always get to choose how people first see you," she said calmly. "But over time, truth has a way of becoming clearer than assumption." The words did not introduce anything new, but they aligned perfectly with everything that had unfolded throughout the evening, bringing a quiet sense of completion to the moment. Ethan nodded slightly, not because he needed to respond, but because the truth of what she said matched what he had experienced throughout the night. Around the table, The remaining guests sat in a relaxed silence, no longer trying to fill space with conversation, because there was nothing unresolved left to address. One by one, small movements signaled the natural winding down of the gathering. Glasses being set down, chairs shifting slightly, subtle signs that the emotional arc of the evening had fully concluded. There was no return to the earlier misunderstanding, no attempt to revisit the moment of humor or embarrassment, because it no longer defined what the evening had become. Instead, what remained was a shared understanding that had replaced it entirely. Ethan slowly exhaled, feeling a sense of calm that came not from being defended, but from being understood without needing to argue for it. Linda Carter gave him one last gentle look, not as a correction, but as acknowledgement, and in that exchange there was a quiet affirmation that required no further words. As the group began to prepare to leave the table, the atmosphere was no longer defined by tension or reversal, but by resolution, a subtle recognition that the story of the night had shifted in a way that would stay with them long after the dinner ended. And as Ethan stood with his family, the final impression of the evening was not the moment of laughter that had once occurred, but the lasting silence that followed understanding, where judgment had been replaced by clarity and assumption had finally given way to truth.